So in today's video, we're going to have a look at a 25-mark question. And this 25-mark question was featured in the macro paper of the Edexcel Economics 2017 series. So that's paper 2. And in both paper 1 and paper 2, so that's micro and macro, there's 3 sections. And in the third section, section C, you have two 25-mark questions, and you must choose one. So the question that we're going to look at today was actually the less popular question of that particular series. So the question is, global oil prices fell from a 2008 peak of $147 a barrel to $27 in 2016. Evaluate the likely macroeconomic consequences of the significant fall in global oil prices. So the first thing to keep in mind is that this is about the macroeconomic consequences. The examiner report, if you read it, that a lot of candidates made the mistake of going on a tangent about microeconomic concepts. So that is how lower oil prices would benefit firms and how these firms would see and how their cost curves would be affected. But that's not what the examiners are looking for. You can maybe introduce a microeconomic concept as long as they have macroeconomic implications. So that's something that you must retain that focus. So what they mean by macroeconomic consequences, stuff like, well, how would this affect our current account, or how would this affect our employment or our output or economic growth or inflation, all of these indicators. And the next thing to keep in mind is evaluation. So what that means is you have to consider both sides of the argument. So to some extent, yes, global oil prices would have a macroeconomic benefit, but there are certainly also macroeconomic costs of low oil prices. Most likely, it's going to be the oil exporting nations that are going to suffer. But we'll be more specific as we go through the points. So your analysis should be structured based on the benefits, and your evaluation should be how they may not benefit certain nations. But more so, what you also have to do to access the top marks is in not just your evaluation paragraphs, but also in your analysis paragraphs, is you have to think about, well, what does the effect of lower oil prices depend on? That is, if I'm to say that one particular macroeconomic benefit of lower oil prices is, let's say, lower costs of production, but it does depend on something, well, just how important oil is in today's economy. In addition, you should also consider the effects on developed countries versus developing countries. So that's I think the structure that you should be approaching. Now, just quickly going through the approach. So we need to have our analysis and evaluation, ideally at least 2 points, so 2 developed points on each side. But I think what's really important is also the supported judgment. And the supported judgment is basically weighing up those arguments that you've made and say, okay, which one is more convincing? And you have to give a justification for that. Now, notice how I haven't said that you need an introduction. And that's because, first of all, when I wrote my essay, so I actually did my A-levels in 2017. And in most of my essays, when I was writing them in school, I didn't do an introduction because it's not really necessary, because it's the analysis and the evaluations that are much more important. I'd rather that you get the main body of text correct and have a really good supported judgment without an introduction than to have a good introduction but have a not so good analysis and supported judgment. So that's why I think the introduction you don't need to stress about at all. So now let's address the main points. What kind of points can we use in this essay? So let's start off with our analysis, and this pertains to the economic benefits of lower oil prices. And as you can probably imagine, it pertains to the oil importing countries. So let's take a country like the UK. So we can, like I said earlier, you can introduce a microeconomic effect of lower cost of production. That's where we're going to start. So our starting point is going to be the firm. So firms, in order to produce, they need to spend money on fuel because fuel is very important in our economy right now. And if you have lower oil prices, then that means firms won't have to pay as much for fuel. And if all firms benefit from this, that means all firms are going to benefit from lower costs of production. And as a result, this is going to culminate in a rightward shift in the SRAS curve. Now, the diagram will be included in the next slide. But long story short is that when there's a rightward shift in the SRAS curve, what you will find is that there's an increase in output and a lower price level. So brilliant diagram. So the good news is we've already introduced our point. We've introduced a chain of analysis, and we've introduced our diagrams. And diagrams are so important in the 25-mark essays. But we can develop this paragraph further, and you must do that in order to access those top marks. Because, for example, knowledge, analysis, and application counts for 16 marks. So if you can, so to get 15 or 16 out of 16, you need to have a really, really long chain of analysis. So therefore, we can expand by saying, well, what can we do with that higher output? Think about it from the perspective of the labor market, or and in terms of employment. If firms are able to produce more because their fuel costs are lower, then that means they will likely demand more workers in order for that output to be achieved. So that means we're going to have more derived demand for labor. And as that happens, that means there's going to be an upward pressure on wages because there's more demand for labor. And there's also going to be a greater quantity of labor employed. And as a result, think about that from a macro perspective, because it's all firms who are going to benefit from lower costs of production. We can safely say that there's going to be more employment growth and higher real wages. The higher real wages because wages have been bid up due to the higher demand, but also the lower price level means that workers' wages have more purchasing power. Now, then we can kind of finish off our paragraph by, in a way, evaluating by saying, well, what does it depend on? Like, how big is the size of this benefit? So would firms experience a very big fall in their cost of production? Not necessarily, because what if oil or fuel only accounts for, let's say, 5% of a typical firm's costs? That means even if oil prices were to fall by 80%, which it has in this, according to this question, that's still not a huge reduction in the cost of production. That's only about a 4% reduction in a firm's overall costs. So as a result, arguably, what we talked about in terms of more labor demand and higher wages will materialize, but to a much lesser extent. And here's the diagram. And as you can see, it's the SRAS curve that just in aggregate demand, we're assuming to be the same. And that has resulted in higher real GDP. Let's talk about this next point. Now, this is also quite key in your essays, is to introduce some diversity. Try and make your paragraphs distinct, where you're talking about a different part of the macro syllabus, because then you are demonstrating to the examiner that you have that wide range of knowledge. And as a result, that's going to contribute to your knowledge, application, and analysis marks, which is marked out of 16. And the evaluation is, of course, out of 9. So we'll start off with the fact that if firms benefit from lower costs of production, that means they can produce more output, as we said earlier. And if they can produce more output and presumably sell more output, they will be able to make higher profits. And also keep in mind what we said before about how if there's higher labor market demand, wages are going to be bid up. And because the government taxes corporate profits and it taxes our personal incomes, we can say that as a result, that is how the government is going to be able to collect more revenue. And then what we can do is say, well, let's identify a benefit of that higher tax revenue. So think about a developing country this time. So not the UK. So think about a country, let's say India. So India is an oil importing country. And if they have more tax revenue, they can potentially finance more supply side policies. And supply side policies include, education, training, investment in healthcare or hospitals, and also investment in infrastructure. And what these programs have the effect of doing is raising the country's productivity. And as that happens, that means we can produce more output in the future. And in turn, it will make it easier for India to develop. So potentially one benefit of lower oil prices, especially for developing countries, is that it could speed up the development process. And what we can do is, once again, finish off that paragraph by saying, well, it really depends on how much tax revenue we can get. And the amount of additional tax revenue that we could realistically gain from lower oil prices depends on just how much output is stimulated as a result of lower oil prices. Because as we said in our previous paragraph, that because firms benefit from lower, if fuel costs are a very small percentage of a firm's total costs, then arguably not much more output is going to be achieved. And therefore, there wouldn't be much higher labor market demand. And in turn, the amount of additional revenue that the government can collect in the form of corporate taxes and personal income taxes will be limited. And of course, your diagrams are important. So these diagrams depict the effect of supply side policies. And essentially, what the real output enables the country to do is develop, because as you learn in your A2 macro, in order for economic development to occur, you must have more productivity. So economic growth is a key prerequisite. Without it, you can't develop. And the reason is because if you don't have economic growth, how can you finance, how can you improve living conditions? How can you improve the living standards and the wages of the population? That's going on to the third analysis point, and this is to do with the current account. So again, a different topic. And this is a reduced current account deficit for importers. Now, why is that? Our starting point is going to be because of the price inelasticity of oil. So oil is price elastic, meaning that if oil prices fall by 80%, the quantity traded or the quantity demanded will increase, but not as much as 80%. So as a result, total value of oil imports will be lower. And since oil is one component of is a component of our total imports, so take a country like the UK, that means we could safely say that overall imports might be lower, presuming of course the other things that the UK imports stays the same. Then we could also take it from this standpoint of exporters. So think about a UK firm like Jaguar Land Rover who produce cars. Since they might experience lower production costs, they might be able to pass on those lower costs in the form of lower prices on the world market. So, and then what we can do is we can develop that further by saying, well, what is the implication of that? Well, the implication is that if PED is more than one, meaning that if UK exports are elastic, that means those lower prices that UK exporters are charging would result in more export revenue. So great, we have more exports and lower imports, which means our net exports are higher, which means we have, by definition, reduced the trade deficit. And since net exports is a component of aggregate demand, we would experience a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve, culminating in a lower unemployment rate and a higher output. And the diagram we can just simply depict using an AD and LRAS curve, with showing a rightward shift in AD. And as you can see, higher output and a lower price level. But also more importantly, in terms of where we are, so at A, so we move from point A to point B. At point A, there's much more unemployment, because let's assume that at B is where we are, is full employment. Well, that's great. That means what lower oil prices might do is it might help the UK improve its unemployment figures. If we're not at full employment, it might help us get there. Now let's talk about the other side, which is why lower oil prices may not necessarily benefit all nations, and in fact might be a severe cost to certain nations, specifically the oil exporting nations, because they rely on oil sales for export revenue. And as we said earlier, as oil is likely inelastic in demand, export revenues will fall. Oil revenues will fall, excuse me. And since 82% of Nigerian exports, for example, are oil exports, the fall in oil revenues will likely culminate in an overall fall in net exports, because it's such a large component of Nigeria's total exports. And as a result, that explains why we would experience a higher current account deficit. Now, notice how this point seems to be very similar to the previous one, because we have two choices. We can either take the route of AD and LRAS diagram that we had in the previous slide, but my advice to you is not to do that. Try and think of another implication of higher or lower current account deficits, because you don't want to repeat yourself, because then that's going to prevent you from getting those top marks. Instead, think about it from the standpoint of balance of payments overall. Since the current account is one of the components of the balance of payments, if we have a much higher current account deficit, it might culminate in an overall balance of payments deficit. And balance of payments deficits cannot be sustained forever. And as a result, it may culminate in a balance of payments crisis. And there are two good examples of this. So take, for example, Mexico in the mid-1990s and Argentina in the early 2000s. So they were suffering from balance of payments crises. And in order for that to be resolved, their currencies experienced major devaluation. And the problem with major currency devaluation is that, let's say, so Mexico uses the Mexican peso. If the Mexican peso is devalued, that means if Mexicans want to buy $100 US dollars worth of food, or $100 US worth of shoes or anything, then that means they're going to need more pesos to do that. And that's going to raise imported inflation, which in turn is going to reduce the purchasing power of Mexican workers. And we can complete that paragraph by saying, well, arguably the cost is going to be much worse for the developing countries rather than developed countries. And the reason is because of foreign currency reserves. You can sustain those balance of payments deficits if you have a large reserve of foreign currencies. But developing countries don't have much in foreign currency reserves. So therefore, the extent of their currency devaluation is likely to be much greater and much more severe. And as a result, the risk of imported inflation is much greater. And as a result, that's going to affect purchasing power much more. So it's arguably much worse for developing countries. Now let's talk about the effect of lower oil prices on government finances for the oil exporting nations. So take a country like Saudi Arabia. In order for the Saudi Arabian government, because they have a state-owned oil company called Aramco, and Aramco's profits, of course, in turn, line the pockets of the government. The government relies, in other words, in order for the government to spend on the things that it spends on, like infrastructure or schooling or whatever it is, they do rely heavily on oil. So in order for the Saudi Arabian government to not run a budget deficit and to run a budget balance, they would need the price of oil to be $80 a barrel. We're only at 27, so we're quite far away. And as a result, governments who rely on oil sales are going to see a significant reduction in their revenues. And if you think about it from the standpoint of a developing oil exporting nation, it's going to be harder for them to finance supply side policies. And in turn, that's going to make the economy potentially less productive in the future. And that's going to lead to lower long run output. And in turn, that's going to prevent economic development, as one major prerequisite for economic development is higher output. And we can conclude that paragraph by saying, well, the extent to which our government finances would be affected by lower oil prices really depends on how dependent that economy in question is. So take Russia or Saudi Arabia. Those countries are very dependent on oil, and their governments stand to lose a lot of their revenue if oil prices are low. So, for example, when oil prices were $27 a barrel, the Saudi Arabian government's budget deficit was equivalent to about 15% of GDP. And that's bigger than the budget deficit that the US experienced during the height of the Great Recession. So clearly it does have quite a dramatic effect on a lot of oil exporting nations' finances. But conversely, think about a country like Norway. So what Norway have done with their oil money over the last few decades is invest that into stocks and bonds and financial assets across the world. And as a result, they then in turn benefit from the dividends from those investments. So as a result, the Norwegian government in that respect has a fairly stable base of revenue. And as a result, if oil prices go down, it doesn't hurt their finances as much. So therefore the Norwegians won't have to make such drastic cuts to their budget like the way Saudi Arabia or Russia would have to. So that's why I think it's the main factor, the dependence on oil. Last but not least, so this is our last point, and it really depends on why oil prices have fallen. And for me, I think this is the most important point. Because what if oil prices are $27 a barrel because we are better at extracting oil and we have found new reserves? So in other words, it's a supply side improvement. Because if we have better extraction technology, that means we can dig up more oil in a particular oil rig. And as a result, for a company, let's say like BP, their average cost, like their cost of production, the cost of extracting and refining oil, is now potentially lower due to that improvement in technology, which has made them more productive. And if the average cost is lower, that means they can then pass on lower prices. They can pass on those lower costs in the form of lower prices to importing nations. And as a result, not only does the UK, so oil importing nations like the UK, benefit from lower oil prices, but it still might be profitable for OPEC. So as a result, that's going to affect their finances less. And as a result, it's not going to warrant as many job cuts, and as a result, OPEC is less harmed in this respect. So as a result, the benefits for the world economy as a whole might be a lot greater, because we have the oil importing nations who are definitely benefiting from the form of lower costs for firms, but also the fact that OPEC is actually able to weather that storm. So now that we've discussed these points, let's think about a supported judgment. Let's weigh it all up and say, I would say that the benefit to the overall world economy really depends on how oil prices have fallen. Because if oil prices have fallen due to better technology, then arguably there's a very large net benefit to the world economy, because the oil exporting nations might still be making a profit, and therefore their governments can continue to finance supply side policies. They can continue to finance their infrastructure, and we won't have the kind of situation that we did with Saudi Arabia or Russia. But of course, in reality, that's not what happened. But you could say that as a candidate, that you could say, well, because we haven't been told why the oil prices fell, we could assume maybe the oil prices fell due to better technology. And as a result, and then of course, we also have the benefit for the oil importing nations. So on balance, here's how I would say. So in conclusion, if oil prices have fallen due to supply side improvements, then the overall benefit to the world economy is greater, and lower oil prices serve as a net benefit for the world economy. So I hope this video is useful in terms of understanding how to approach the essay questions. So I think 2 points on either side is good enough, but just to be safe, if you can think of 3 and 3, that would be ideal. And if you are in an exam situation, just plan your essay for 4 or 5 minutes. And in that time, what you're going to do is you're just write down everything that you could possibly think of. So even if you find that you have potentially 8 benefits, or like 5 benefits on one side and 5 costs on another side, choose which ones are the best. Which ones can you develop into a really detailed paragraph so you can access those top marks? And those 3 particular points, or those 6 particular points for me, is what stood out. So as a result, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.